Welcome to our webinar, the California Policy Forum. This is a webinar on securing the right to vote and election protection strategies. The California Policy Forum is a unique partnership between Cal Nonprofits, Philanthropy California, and the League of California Community Foundation. We provide a platform that brings together the voice of nonprofits and philanthropy in our state and amplifies our sector's significance and priorities to policymakers, experts, and our respective member organizations. We thought this was a timely subject to talk about and uplift this year, especially in the midst of elections and after having just passed the primaries. So we have a special panel for y'all today. I would love to introduce Michael Gomez Daly from uh, the California Donor Table as our moderator today, and then I'll give it to you, Michael.
Thank you, Matthew. Good morning, everybody. Name is Michael Gomez Daly. I'm the Director of Democracy Programs here at California Donor Table Fund. We're convening at a pivotal moment. Nationally, we are seeing a three-pronged strategy to undermine our democracy, legislative attacks on voting like the SAVE Act, executive efforts to interfere with VBM with new USPS policies, and via the judicial, a Supreme Court that has effectively gutted key protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act through Calais ruling. When you add in the reports of federal agents subpoenaing voter registration and civic engagement nonprofits in other states, namely Ohio, the message is clear. Discourage participation, scare those increasing access, and disenfranchise the persistent. Here in California, we are the main character in this narrative. Because we're a model for accessible, secure voting, we are the primary target. We see this in the misinformation campaigns attacking our ballot carrying procedures, Shasta's recently passed initiative to dismantle mail-in voting and require IDs to vote, and a November ballot initiative seeking to mandate voter ID here in California. Even our post-election ballot counting window is being brought before the Supreme Court, an institution that has been unwilling to stand up to nationalist and fascist interests. But it's not all doom and gloom. We have a North Star here in California, and that is California's resilience. Our state legislature is not just reacting, they are leading. With the passage of California Voting Rights Act of 2026 and SB 73, we're actively state-proofing our democracy to protect voters from intimidation and ensuring that our election systems remain transparent and accessible, regardless of what authoritarian national forces are attempting. Our goal today is to bridge the gap between this environment and your impact. We will hear from leaders on the front lines who are working tirelessly to protect access for Californians. We're going to discuss how we can build on-ramps for engagement that are effective, scalable, and crucially achievable with your support. These stakes have never been higher, but our infrastructure has never been stronger, and we have history on our side. Today, you'll be hearing from Dora Rose, Deputy Director of the League of Women Voters, Mike Dow, Executive Director of Move the Valley, and Bella Lopez, Program Officer with the East Bay Community Foundation. First, we will hear from the amazing Dora Rose. Dora, please share with us what's at stake in the 2026 midterm elections.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, Michael. That was the perfect introduction. You laid out a lot of what I want to talk about here. We are absolutely are facing unprecedented attacks on our voting rights, premised in denialism and sort of designed to sow distrust in our election. It's no longer an abstraction happening somewhere else. It's showing up right here in California. And, alongside those, we've got our own homegrown crisis of representation. We've got communities of color and young people voting at far lower rates than older, white, wealthier Californians. I'll talk more about that participation gap in a moment. I just got a message that my internet is unstable. Are you guys okay hearing me?
Yes, I can hear and see
Okay,
you.
cool. Let me know because I can actually switch my internet thing. Um, so, the work is really kind of double-sided, fighting the threats, right? And simultaneously building the infrastructure that invites people back in. So starting at the federal level, as Michael noted, over the past year, federal authority and federal law enforcement have really been weaponized to amplify discredited election claims, right? Last year, the president issued an executive order trying to add documentary proof of citizenship requirements to registration and to curtail mail voting. So the league and partners of ours sued, and the courts were very clear on this. The Constitution assigns election lawmaking to the states and to Congress, not to the president by directive. Then this March, he issued a second order aimed squarely at how Californians vote. It directs Homeland Security to compile citizenship lists from federal databases that are riddled with gaps, riddled with problems, with errors, and he directs the Postal Service to refuse to deliver mail ballots from voters not on that federally approved list. So in California, where more than 80% of us vote by mail, what that means is a federal agency working from really bad data would stand between millions of eligible Californians and the ballot box. The National League is in court fighting that right now, but litigation is slow, and the chaos does damage even when we do win. And then, as I mentioned, there's the Supreme Court, which in Louisiana v. Calais gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the provision that for 40 years allowed voters to challenge maps that weaken Black and brown voting power. This decision gives states permission to dismantle majority-minority districts so long as they claim that they're pursuing partisan goals. People bled and died for those rights, and they were eviscerated by 6 justices with, the sweep of a pen. And now we're waiting on Watson, which is a Mississippi mail ballot case that asks whether states can count ballots postmarked by election day but delivered after. And California is one of those states with the grace period. Right now it's 7 days. So a problem for us. Now, I want to move to the fight on your November ballot, the voter ID constitutional amendment. I know this is on a lot of people's minds. And this one is straight out of the Trump playbook, right? The president tried to hold up wildfire relief unless California adopted strict voter ID. That was his first move. And this measure's sponsor, Carl DeMaio, has sort of positioned himself as the administration's California operative on elections. So let me just go over very briefly what this voter ID measure would do. It requires government-issued ID every time you vote in person with no clear list of what counts and no exception for people who don't have one, not in the measure itself. It requires every male voter to write the last 4 digits of an ID number on the outside of their return envelope. So that ID number would likely be something like a social security number or driver's license number. Very sensitive data. It forces elections officials to run voters through the same unreliable federal citizenship database that I mentioned earlier, and it lets anyone sue counties for noncompliance. The whole thing is built on a lie. The lie being that voter impersonation and non-citizen voting are problems. They are not. There's a lot of data to support that. California also already verifies voters at every stage, right? Our ID is matched when we do voter registration. We have roster sign-in at the polls, and we've got signature verification on every mail ballot. So you got to ask yourself, what would this actually accomplish? Would you write the last 4 digits of your social security number on the outside of an envelope with your name and your address and your signature right next to it, and then drop it in the mail? When Texas imposed a similar mail ballot ID rule, roughly 1 in 8 ballots was rejected in the first election. And, rejected for things like blank fields and transposed digits, not because of any ineligibility problem. You scale that to California, and you've got millions of ballots at risk, right? And of course, as we all know, the burden's going to fall unevenly on people of color, on young people, people with disabilities, all of whom are disproportionately less likely to have qualifying ID. And even if a free state ID is part of this package, it's never free, right? It costs time off of work and transportation and fees for underlying documents. That amounts to a modern day poll tax. And you asked me to talk a little bit about the SAVE Act. It's something that the Congress is still debating. It keeps coming up for votes. It would nationalize the same sort of paperwork trap. It would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, not just checking a box attesting to your to your citizenship, but producing documents like a passport or birth certificate. Now, that sounds really simple until you remember that millions of Americans do not have those documents, and many people's documents don't match their current name. Married women are the obvious example. If your birth certificate has one name, your current ID has another, you get caught in the gap. Same with folks who are transgender. So the SAVE Act is not just an abstract federal bill. It's part of the same strategy, making voting harder by making registration more bureaucratic, more expensive, more unforgiving. Now, the good news on this is that education works. And when voters hear what the voter ID measure would actually do, we see support collapsing. We've seen that in polls. So we are ramping up a no campaign here in California, but we anticipate significant spending from the other side. So it is very much an uphill climb to get this message across to voters. And then, don't assume that this all stays federal and statewide. Huntington Beach passed its own local voter ID law that we actually helped to defeat. In Shasta County, election denialism has degraded election administration itself. They cut the number of drop boxes available. They eliminated electronic poll books that cause incredibly long lines. And now voters in Shasta County have actually passed Measure B, which is a frontal attack on voting by mail, on early voting, on state election law. We can talk about that a little later if you want to. And then in Riverside, a sitting sheriff, himself a candidate for governor, used warrants to seize over 650,000 ballots from a certified election based on claims that the county's own registrar had already completely debunked. So, it's because federal rights have been gutted, because not all of our districts are drawn fairly, and because of all these things happening in those counties that I just mentioned, that the League is co-sponsoring the California Voting Rights Act of 2026 alongside a very broad coalition called the California Democracy Partnership. I urge you to check them out after this. After Calais, state voting rights acts are really only one of the remaining tools that we've got to remedy racial discrimination in voting. The CVRA would make voter suppression illegal under California law. That's blocking or burdening, access to the ballot. It would close loopholes on vote dilution. That's where, voters can cast ballots, but the election system itself prevents their votes from translating fairly into political power. So, for example, districts can be drawn to split a cohesive protected community across multiple districts, or to pack that community into too few districts so that its voters are denied a fair opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And the CVRA would address that. The bill also authorizes race-neutral remedies to vote dilution, which is really important after Calais, including systems like proportional ranked choice voting, and we can dive into that more later if you want. A companion bill, part of the CVRA, locks federal language access guarantees into state law and expands translated materials to more communities. Now, I know you wanted me to talk about what the June primary told us, and we're going to hear more about that in a moment from folks who were really part of that election protection effort. From an election protection standpoint, it was mercifully quiet, perhaps partly because California has been hardening its defenses, and I'm happy to go deeper into that during our conversation. But an important lesson that I want to sort of point out that happens at every election is about who shows up to our California elections. And the pattern, unfortunately, holds every cycle. Elections are decided by the unrepresentative electorate that I mentioned earlier. We know what closes that participation gap, and it's the same thing that counters intimidation and disinformation. It's trusted messengers, it's community-based organizations funded to do education and outreach year-round, right? Nearly half of young Californians don't know where to find basic voting information. We've got millions of limited English proficient voters who never get materials that they can use because it's not in their language. And we've got many non-voters saying that they simply don't have enough information about the candidates or the issues to feel ready to cast a ballot. And turnout data is showing that the burden falls hardest on young voters and voters of color. And if the Supreme Court rules that mail ballots have got to be received by election day, which maybe coming up this Thursday in their latest tranche of decisions, then, the rules could change overnight, at least for federal elections, for the 80% of Californians who vote by mail. And this problem of engaging voters with the right messaging is going to become a lot more important to solve. Every voter who spent 20 years safely mailing a ballot on election day is going to suddenly be at risk of losing their vote to postal delays that they had no role in causing, right? Reaching every California mail voter with a mail a week early or use a Dropbox sort of message before November is going to be one of the largest voter education lifts that this state has ever attempted. So, I started off sort of saying that this work is double-sided, right? We're fighting those threats while we're building the thing that invites people back in, right? Meeting those threats takes real resources. It takes litigation and rapid response and county-by-county defense. But we're also building that affirmative side, right? Like laws like the California Voting Rights Act and language access protections that expand who can participate. There's other things brewing as well. And we back that up by this patient and year-round work of helping people to register, understand their ballot, and trust that their ballot's going to actually count, right? That last part, convincing people that their vote is worth casting, it's the one thing that no court ruling and no executive order is going to be able to reach, right? So that is the broad landscape. We are facing a coordinated effort to make voting harder and to convince people that the whole system is rigged so that they give up on it entirely. So they get tired of it, they don't engage, right? So the project is super daunting, but we do believe that every piece of it is answerable, right? It's answerable in the courts and at the ballot box and in the legislature, and in the everyday work of reaching voters where they are. The other side is betting. It's betting that we're going to be too overwhelmed to do all of this at once, right? And it's betting that it could just keep causing chaos and throwing things at us. I don't think that they're right, okay? The people in this room are certainly not giving up the fight. So let me leave it there. Let others speak, and I really do look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Was hoping to hear from you, and how does the election protections and democracy landscape work look differently in region like Central Valley? And what are the opportunities for more support within underserved regions like that?
Thank you, Michael. First, good morning, everyone, and thank you to California Policy Forum for having this discussion and inviting Move the Valley to participate. So just really want to give gratitude to the timeliness of this conversation and the invitation to participate. I'll take the privilege to do a bit of a introduction of Move the Valley before I dive directly into your question, Michael, in case there are some folks who are not familiar with our organization. Move the Valley is a civic engagement coalition based in the San Joaquin Valley. MOVE stands for Mobilize, Organize, Vote, Empower. And we are a nonpartisan, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and intergenerational coalition of grassroots community-based organizations. We work from furthest south is Kern County, up through the San Joaquin Valley into Sacramento. And currently we have 5 partner organizations. We have Community for New California, Hmong Innovating Politics, Jakarta Movement, and Community Water Center that participate as core partners in our coalition. And our member organizations work together to expand access to democracy, aiming to, develop and build community leadership to amplify the voices of historically marginalized communities. And the bulk of the core programs that we do is centered on, outreach, education, get out the vote campaigns. For the purposes of this conversation today, and everything that, Dora shared out, Move the Valley sits at the intersection of like power building, and we are not a policy shop, right? But I love that, today's conversation really kind of blends those two pieces together with the things that even Dora has highlighted so far. And so, I'll speak more broadly on the aspect of us being a community-based organization, doing that work year round, like Dora mentioned, and really connecting with voters and residents, boots on the ground. Um, Last year, with the federal administration sending DOJ poll observers to the Central Valley specifically because of the special election, we made an internal decision that election protection was going to be something that we needed to do for 2026. That information that came out, at the end of last year or right before that election cycle, we weren't able to get together, right, resources and a big team right away. So I sent myself to Kern County, and we sent a couple of volunteers out, which really started the blueprint and the foundation for the election protection program work that we decided to go, full force in this year. So last year's, California special election, we ran a really big phone banking team of 55 individuals who basically were calling Monday through Friday and connecting with voters. We called over 800,000 voters last year and talked about 30,000 of them. And what we were hearing was that individuals in mixed status families and voting citizens themselves were afraid of ICE and was afraid of having, ICE presence at, polling locations, or just afraid that showing up to vote meant that they were going to be seen by the wrong person who could then, enforce some type of racial profiling or harm or violence upon them, right? So the fear was so real, again, leading up to election day, that we felt the need to really figure out like what would a poll observer, poll monitor or poll protector, quote unquote, program look like. And that really, again, set the foundation for our work this year. So we responded with resolve this year, and we mobilized and trained 43 election protectors with the collective recruitment of our 5 partner organizations. And we ran a 3-hour training, 2-part training, one on poll monitoring, traditional kind of training, and then the other part was actually straight legal observation training, just in case there was a situation where our poll monitors had to take off the hat, right, of being a poll monitor and actually strictly be a legal observer, and not, get in between law enforcement and whatever activity was happening. And these 43 people committed to an 8-hour shift on election day and covered these polling locations and vote centers up until the closing of each polling location. I'm really proud to say that with this team, we did cover 161 polling locations across the 9 counties that we work in. And that is a really, really great effort. However, right, because some of our counties are not VCA counties yet, we have, traditional polling site counties, which are hundreds, right? So for example, in Kern County alone, there are over 100 polling sites. And so if we look at it from, coverage percentage wise, that 161 was only 30% of the more than 500 polling locations in the Central Valley. And so there's a lot more work to be done. In addition to the polling protection team, we actually had a multifaceted and multi-pronged approach. So we coupled that program with our this year 65-person phone banking team, who also ran a hotline. So we had folks doing the get out the vote efforts, and then in those conversations, we revealed in language Hmong, Spanish, and Punjabi hotlines for any individuals who wanted to pass on the information to their friends and their family who might have need help, who we didn't call directly through the phone bank program. And then in addition to the hotlines, we actually piloted 3 special in-language programs, one in Spanish, one in Hmong, and one in Punjabi, primarily focused in Fresno County, to really kind of be, boots on the ground and provide that physical presence in addition to the poll protectors on election day. And so these were all of the different components of what we felt we needed to do beyond your traditional, like, get out the vote. Hey, are you voting? IDing you. Great. Moving on and talking to the next person because of the reality of the information that we received last year in our phone banking program, right? And so it was a very, like, comprehensive with like some referrals and follow-up internal kind of communication. We even built in a text messaging program into it. And I think that, overall, we really felt that the folks who did want the information, who did really need that extra push, or like Dora said, to feel like they were talking to somebody who they could trust, because our, coalition partners are also organizations that have done, boots on the ground work, and they are the trusted messengers, and they are providing, the outreach in culturally responsive ways in language, right? And really, actually, the special programs were actually door-to-door programs, right? And community events in the communities where they were going to. And so we really had that presence, before and on election day, to ensure almost like a full circle service as much as possible for folks who really did have, the hesitation or the fear to really exercise their right to vote. Even again in this political climate with, tensions being so high, but knowing that folks really wanted to participate. And I think I want to just share that, what voting or voter intimidation and suppression traditionally sounds like is, a lot of, aggressive violence or harm, potentially, right? Like we've had, again, even in Madera County, ballot boxes burned and put to fire. But I think voter suppression, for today's conversation, I want to expand that a little bit more and have us really think that, voter suppression doesn't need to be violent to be effective, right? Uncertainty is already enough to turn people away. And this goes back to what Dora mentioned, which is one of my main points too, is that, the amazing work that we're doing with the California policies that we have already around voting rights, um, is way far ahead than most of the states, right? However, if people actually don't feel that they are protected, or they don't feel that they can actually feel, be safe, even again as a citizen voting individual, then that act to actually take that, that right to vote, is a huge reality and a barrier that we need to overcome, right? And so, I think that, with that context, I know I'm going a little bit over time here, Michael. I just want to share that, with the Valley, and the work that we did, we were a part of a really great kind of statewide narrative and messaging conversation and cohort, with, We Are California and the California Can't Stop California campaign, which I think, things like that are really important, is to have, messaging and information and kind of training that folks can take and tailor and make it, relatable to the region that they're working with. So again, just a shout out to the We Are California folks and the legal team that, they worked with to really come up with the foundational pieces of the training that we had. And also, our main partner, Faith in the Valley, who, runs the Valley Rapid Watch Network. And they were so critical to the legal observation piece of our training as well, too, to make sure that this could happen. So I'm sorry, Michael, I'm not sure if I answered your question directly. If there's something that I'm missing there, please let me know.
Thank you, Mai. Bella, can you talk with us about the intersection of C4 work and election protections and strengthening democracy?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And just want to give gratitude to the co-host and to Dora and Mai for your leadership in this work and field. My name is Bella Lopez. I'm with the East Bay Community Foundation. I lead our community organizing, power building, and movement building program area at EBCF. So just for context, EBCF is a community foundation. We're located in the East Bay, and we specifically support Contra Costa and Alameda County. Our North Star is centered on building an East Bay where everyone has the economic freedom to dream, heal, and belong. And we advance this work through 4 core grant-making areas: our fostering inclusive economies model, an arts and culture for social and racial justice, capacity building with a racial equity lens, and our community organizing, power building, and movement building program area. And as mentioned earlier, I lead the community organizing program area at EBCF, which really focuses on the how we support of long-term power building towards economic freedom through this work, we support two main strategies: base building and movement infrastructure. And movement infrastructure we consider as organizations who provide the backbone to our movement, which includes funding coalitions, alliances, and civic engagement tables, for example. And as part of this work, one of EBCF's core strategies is to provide strategic funding when applicable to support aligned projects to 501(c)(4) organizations and advance advocacy work. And as we're a community foundation, we believe that the ability to support C4 grant making and advocacy work is one of our key strengths in the power building ecosystem as a funder, and know that building power and strengthening democracy over the long term happens across entities, which is why we've been committed to supporting aligned and C4 advocacy grant making. And just a little bit about how we do this work. We partner with key organizations in the region and Alameda and Contra Costa to determine when EBCF support can support aligned projects to C4 organizations and advocacy. And this is in election cycles and beyond election cycles. And projects oftentimes focus on supporting, the larger work around strengthening democracy, so building community leadership, advancing local advocacy work, expanding nonpartisan voter engagement, or in election years, we work to support aligned ballot measures and initiatives that can advance economic justice in the region and aim to change material conditions for our community. We've heard time and time again that election-based booms of civic engagement funding is not enough to sustain and build a base. So this is, the reason that we are committed to this work year round and in conversations with partners about how our funding can support beyond election cycles, to really think about building the infrastructure and power building ecosystems in the East Bay. And for us, this really requires having relationships with partners that transcend quantitative outcomes and really lean into, as a community foundation, understanding the needs of the local organizing landscape and build relationship with folks who are on the ground and actually doing this work. That's based on a shared commitment to strengthening democracy, to building long-term power, and advancing economic freedom in the region. And, as I said earlier, and as was mentioned by Maya and Dora, we know that strengthening democracy and elections protection is an ongoing and year-round need. And as a regional funder supporting power building, we're also aiming to support the work that builds and move systems that center the interest of our communities and also build trust in our system. So while we support the various coalitions and alliances, we're also supporting the organizations who are working in close proximity to everyday people through base building. These are the organizations we often turn to in election-based cycles to do voter engagement, door-to-door, train observers, deploy information on voting rights. And while funding is incredibly important during election cycles, a part of our dedication to this work is ensuring that those organizations have the infrastructure and capacity to lead this work ongoingly year-round. And so while we're supporting work that's strengthening our democracy, such as like voter engagement, voter education, door-to-door, et cetera, we're also dedicated to supporting work that aims to shift like local policies that give people tangible results and changing conditions for our community members so that they're seeing the results of their contributions. As well as continuing to support the ongoing work needed to activate a base of young people, people of color, working class voters. And just wanted to wrap this up by saying that while EBCF is dedicated to supporting C4 and advocacy work, we know that alone, we can't do this alone. And that our work has to be in the context of a larger ecosystem, which includes taking direction from our community partners on strategy and being in deep partnership with other funders, both regional funders and statewide, to think about what does it mean to support this work holistically year-round, and in election-based cycles. So we'd invite other funders, to be in conversation with us. We engage and host funder tables, to think about how we can support, both within the context of C3 funding and how EBCF's funding can be used most strategically to advance advocacy grant making. And would love to, be in conversations both with private foundations, community foundations, to think about how we can advance this work in unison, in conjunction with each other and what's happening within community. I'll pass it back to you, Michael.
Thank you. And thank you, Mai, Dora, and Bella. Thank you for everything that you presented. So we're going to be moving into a panel discussion segment. I do encourage folks, if you have questions that you would like us to take on in real time, please put it into the chat. But I'm going to kick us off and ask about the June primaries. What are some of the learnings or key takeaways from the June primaries? Were there gaps that need to be addressed for the general elections later in the year? Bella, Dora, and Mai, if you don't mind coming off mute and turning on camera, hop on in.
Hello.
Dora, what are some of the key takeaways from the June primaries?
So, as I mentioned, it was fairly quiet, and I don't expect that to necessarily continue. There were a few incidents that just gave us a sense of what could be coming. But honestly, I think when you're asking about the June primary, what you're really asking about is what protections are in place against federal interference. So I can sort of talk about that a little bit if it would be helpful. Um, and is that sort of the direction that you want me to go in?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
primarily seeing some of the stuff happening in LA. I'd be
yeah,
interested to know.
right, right. So first of all, I sort of want to give a lay of the land, and then I'd like to turn over to my partners who are out in the field and really probably saw more than we did in our, little boiler room fielding calls. Um, so let me just give you an understanding of what protections are in place and then, where the gaps might be, right? It's already illegal under federal law to intimidate, threaten, or coerce someone for voting or trying to vote. That includes threatening arrest or aggressively questioning voters about, citizenship, right, or eligibility, following or surveilling voters, blocking access, or using the presence of armed federal agents to scare people away from the polls. And California law actually adds more protection to that. Voter intimidation is a felony. Armed personnel, uniformed law enforcement, private guards, security personnel cannot simply be posted near polling places or elections offices. And federal law enforcement is included in that restriction. So we're talking also about ICE. California also protects voters from being photographed or blocked or harassed within the voting area. There are newer protections that go directly to what people are worried about. Law enforcement, and this is bills that have either moved through already the legislature and been signed as urgency legislation or that are coming up. Law enforcement can't interfere with election administration. They can't demand access to voting systems or voter rolls or, ballot handling areas or voted ballots just because they show up with badges. That's a new bill that just went into effect to deal with the Riverside County issue. Ballots stay in the custody of elections officials at all times, even if there's an investigation. And then access to election machinery requires real legal authority and not just pressure that we're placing on elections officials. There's this pending bill that would bar law enforcement from making arrests within 200 feet of a polling place while voting is happening. Except for very serious crimes, there's an exception for disruption of or people or property because, if somebody goes in and disrupts, we want to have some way of dealing with that. So if ICE shows up, they can't intimidate voters, they can't block the polls, they can't question people in a way that chills voting. They can't station armed agents at voting sites or interfere with election workers or seize ballots or access voter rolls or voting systems without a court order. Um, But the law only matters, if people are ready to use it in real time. And a voter who turns around and leaves is not helped by prosecution months later. So there are certainly concerns that remain. It's why we need poll observers that are trained, and that is happening increasingly. It's why we need rapid response legal hotlines like, 866 Our Vote. It's why we need folks who are out there videotaping and recording. And it's why we need to make sure that our elections officials know exactly what to do when agents show up. So we pass all these laws, and now we need to make sure that they are implemented well. So that's really more about how we're going to take some of the concerns that we have and protect voters in November than it was about the June primary. And maybe my colleagues want to talk a little bit more about the June primary itself.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. I mean, there's a few pieces here on lessons learned, right, and gaps, and maybe I'll name a few and then hone in on one specific piece. I mean, I think the reality again is that there is fear and there is a lot of confusion. And that is stemming from misinformation and disinformation, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to combat those types of narratives and that misinformation and disinformation. And again, that fear in itself doesn't have to be violent to be effective for voter suppression, right? The other piece is just the sheer, coverage and the gaps that we have, right? And like what Dora mentioned, in being present to witness, right? To record or to see that something actually did go wrong or did not go accordingly to policies and procedures, whether that's with a community member against another voter or even an election, worker with the voter that is coming across their, the day of to vote in person. And so I think that there is definitely, a need to increase the amount of poll protectors, right? Move the Valley is trying to do that. A lot of other organizations across the state are trying to do that, but I don't think we have enough people trained to be able to do it. And just on election day is one feat, but we have vote centers now, right? That are open 14 days, 11 days, 4 days before June 2nd or before election day. And so how do we get, poll protectors even out into the field sooner than the big, last day of election? And then I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough that is an opportunity that I want to share out loud here is that, the year-round organizing is so important. The year-round support, right, funding resources coming before the election cycle is critical to ensure that that year-round organizing happens. And one relationship that definitely needs to be increased is the relationship between community organizations and county elections offices, right? Like Dora mentioned, it's a county by county operation, although there are, state and federal guidelines. Each county has some layer of doing things their own way. And so what we're seeing is that these processes are not the same across, right? With my 160 poll locations that we went to and 43, poll protectors, they all had different experiences engaging with election staff and processes and protocol. And, there are some irregularities that have come up there. So I think it's really important to think about how are we investing in the organizations that want to build the relationships with these elections offices, because these relationships can determine whether a voter's concern gets resolved on election day or becomes a barrier that silences them, right? It also determines whether we have, somebody who is willing to pick up the phone when something happens, right? That is, urgent and, again, before or on election day. And I think that these are the pieces that can definitely be strengthened. And these are the pieces that Move the Valley specifically knows that elections offices in the Valley, right, with, Board of Supervisors who tend to lean more, conservative, those are the relationships that are strained that we really need to build as well.
Yeah, I can jump in. As a foundation, we're a step removed from the on the ground work, but just doubling down on the need to support kind of the emerging infrastructure that's happening as a result of all the other ongoing attacks in our communities. and that that there are folks being organized who got involved because of the tax on immigrant communities and trans folks, and how we're doubling down in that moment instead of moving away um, from community organizing. So coming in earlier, it's already June, and I think instead of waiting to see what the ballot plays out, what's going to be priorities, is really thinking about how we're supporting the infrastructure of the organizations who are, leading the on the ground organizing at this moment.
And Bella, I have a follow-up question specifically for you. Given that you're a community foundation and you all do have C4 capabilities, like how are you working with other foundations to diversify how funding goes into the field, and how can other private foundations work with y'all to maximize their dollars towards activities that might be more forward looking?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So EBCF, we have funds that can go directly towards advocacy on ballot measures, like support lobbying, direct lobbying for that. We use our non-donor dollars, so our most unrestricted funds that come from, investment income, rental income, et cetera. In terms of like strategically partnering together, we also host funders tables. So we have a local funders table called Multiracial Democracy Table, which thinks about how we're increasing democracy in Alameda County. We partner with local private foundations to bring in community organizations who are leading on the ground work to be able to best articulate to funders like what the reality is, and what are some priorities, and how can they mobilize support through their C3 dollars as well. For EBCF, for us to be able to use, our unrestricted dollars the most strategically, requires that we have unrestricted dollars available. So in preparation for election years, ensuring that, we can provide an ongoing grant making through C3 work, by fundraising from private foundations to support, some of our like ongoing programmatic work. And that allows us to free up our unrestricted dollars to support, the funds that are most aligned and most free, right? So, or unrestricted.
I'm assuming this applies to community foundations across the state.
Yeah, different community foundations have different models. So I always encourage folks, to identify where their internal revenue comes from, how much of their funds are, available that come from non-donor dollars, to work with their legal counsel, to work with campaign finance counsel, to identify like funding sources that could be the best for them. So, EBCF, we're lucky we have a lot of internal buy-in, which means that there's relationships and conversations that happen not just in the programs team, but across our grants management and finance to be able to determine how it best can work for EBCF.
Cool, appreciate that. Dora, I have a specific question looking forward. We have these new USPS policies that are coming down that are going to affect the general. Supreme Court's about to take up the VBM question. And then I think a lot of folks are still figuring out what to do post-Calais. You've been in conversations with stakeholders across the state who are working with the legislature on remedies and other proactive solutions. Can you dive in a little bit about some of those? I know I listed three, but in any one of those.
So in terms of the Watson one is on our minds the most because I think we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to say yet. So we have to think through a lot of options. The big question is going to be how this is managed in the state related. So let me back up a second. The Watson decision will impact federal ballots, right? It will say that we can't count, it might say that in the worst case scenario, that we can't count ballots that are received after election day. So we can't have a grace period. If you mail your ballot on election day, you're sunk. You have to mail it a week before election day, right? That applies to federal ballots. Under current state law, we have a grace period that would continue to apply for state ballots. So what we would have is a split ballot situation where elections officials would have to count ballots that come in for state contests, local contests, and give it the grace period. But federal ballots that come in after election day would have to be discounted. So just figuring out how in November, which is only a few months away, we can make sure that the elections officials are resourced and have the technology to be able to do that kind of a split counting is um, a huge undertaking and something that we're thinking through now. Um, and because we don't really know exactly how the court will rule, or even if it's going to impact our upcoming November elections, or whether they're going to, hold it back and give folks more time to figure out how to adjust to it. It's all quite up in the air. What was the other,
Well, before actually, I want to loop back around because I have a follow-up question for Maya regarding this. We saw, the USPS changes when they went to regional hubs. I think Prop 50, we saw that ballots that returned after the time had quadrupled and it disaffected inland California the most. How is that playing out in the field, Maya, with your work? And how can philanthropy help to ensure that if this Watson ruling comes down and it's not great and it affects our November election, how we're preempting that and ensuring that voters understand the new policies and regulations?
Yeah, I mean, just with the example from last year and even this year around mailing in your ballots in time, right? It was a huge issue that we had to intentionally train all of our phone bankers at one point in the campaign to really embed into right their script and their survey in the survey that we were conducting, which is do you have any challenges and barriers and how do you plan to vote in person or by mail? And if somebody said I'm going to vote by mail, depending on where we're at in the program, we had to say actually we would highly encourage you to take this in person to a vote center or drop it off because right now it's not going to make it in time, right, if you go through United States Postal Services. So really we were so intentional about that last year and again even this year because again there are a lot of things that are just confusing for folks, right? To like really think through. And of course, voters, they have lives and they are doing things last minute and they might have planned for something or they just barely relocated their ballot, right? And they really don't want to go in person. And so a lot of that is like a lot of intentional pre-planning in the program design phase and then training with the actual phone bankers and all of the support teams, right? The special programs that we have. I mean, with this, USPS situation, I think that what this means for the communities that Move the Valley works with is that again there's still fear and fear suppresses turn out more reliably than anything else and confusion as well too, right? And we have farm worker families who their nearest polling site might be 45 minutes away, right? Or the nearest election office might be and again if we're encouraging them to vote by mail versus in person and they're in this dilemma or right they never got their mail-in ballot in the first place and having them just overcome all of those challenges and those barriers. So just really thinking through even from a logistical standpoint on how to really help support somebody. And then does that turn into transportation support, right? And transportation plus then translation and interpretation support, right? And so all of these different things that, kind of come down to do you have your ballot in time and can we get it? And can we get it to count in time? Yeah, so I think that's the first layer to kind of answer the first part of your question. I'm so sorry. The second part of your question was?
No, 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 that's great. I
I
think
also want to say one of the pieces of legislation we're supporting is adding more drop boxes so that there's more accessibility for drop boxes. And the messaging has to be around if you mail your ballot, you should walk it into a post office, and that might not be that accessible for folks, and actually get that postmark stamped onto your ballot at the time that you mail it because of this delay, this postmarking delay that is causing a lot of problems.
so. I want to pivot a little bit to, I mean, going back to Calais. So we had a history here in California of local cities moving from at-large to district elections to address polarized voting. And then in light of Calais, I think, and you should correct me, Dora, but I think now that's no longer an option or it won't be going forward. How are folks thinking about addressing that and still being able to remedy polarized voting in small cities? I know here in the IE where I live, that was a game changer for a lot of getting proper representation and candidates
Right.
of choice for communities of color.
Yeah. So just to back up, so the problem that you're talking about is the sort of technical name is vote dilution, right? Structuring the election so that votes don't translate into fairly into political power. And that can happen through unfairly drawn districts, right? Not just in at-large districts, which the historical, the Voting Rights Act that we've had for 25 years addresses. Before Calais, the Federal Voting Rights Act was often used to require districts that are drawn to remedy uh, racial vote dilution, right? Calais made that kind of race-conscious districting remedy much more vulnerable. California can still draw fair districts around communities of interest, so we're not done with, districting, drawing fair district maps. But the CVRA would also make sure that courts have other tools available. And I think that's what you're getting at, right? Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about those other tools?
Yeah, I mean, if you can enlighten us and educate us a little bit.
Sure. Um, so that's where, and this is getting really wonky, but that's where proportional ranked choice voting and cumulative voting comes in. Systems like that, these alternative voting systems, they are race neutral because they don't classify voters by race. They don't draw racial districts, which we were allowed to do before to address racial discrimination, right? Or require any kind of racial targeting. They change the election rules for everyone. So in a multi-seat election, cohesive groups of voters can pool their voting strength through these mechanisms and win representation roughly in proportion to the share of the electorate, at least theoretically. These are new systems and they've been tested in certain places, but not entirely tested. So we have to be a little bit careful about the way that they get applied. But the idea is that if a protected community votes together, it can gain a fair shot at representation, not because the law sorted people by race, but because the voting system gives any kind of cohesive group the ability to translate votes into seats. Okay. And cumulative voting, which is another mechanism under this idea, works sort of similarly. Voters get multiple votes and they can concentrate them on one candidate, or they can spread them out. But again, the system doesn't ask where voters are. It just, who the voters are. It just sort of, it gives voters a way to avoid being permanently shut out by a winner-take-all rule. And that's sort of the point. These remedies can address racial vote dilution without relying on race-conscious line drawing.
Thank you. Um, so I want to look towards November, and California's been the center of this narrative, particularly in counting our votes, and I think actually this cycle was pretty short in terms of like most of the races were called within a week and a half. But there's this narrative that we take forever and all that jazz, and we've been obviously the center of the administration's attention. What can we do to combat that narrative? Is this legislative? Is it narrative? Is it, how does it happen? And also, how can philanthropy and others and donors support? Because I hear folks being like, why is California taking so long to vote? And it's like, well, we have democracy out here, and this is what it's going to take. So, would just love to hear from everybody a sentence or two about your thoughts. Bella, do you mind going first?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah, I think I mean part of it's like civic engagement. Like how are we continuously funding um basic civic engagement and understanding of communities. So um I'd encourage funders that don't have that are issue specific, right? Whether it's education, health, environment, is to think about that lens through which through civic engagement. Is like how is civic engagement a through line and organizing a through line in the different issue areas, because you can't advance equitable healthcare without having people know the systems around them, how they can contribute to them, and how they make change. So I'd encourage funders, whether it's through partnership with other foundations or donors or community groups, to think about how, regardless of issue area, their work can think about funding civic engagement.
My
Yeah, I mean, I would say we definitely still need the fight, on the policy side. So thank you, Dora, and everybody else who's involved in that. Whether those policies are kind of reactive, right, like SB 73, or, proactive in the sense, and, with the California Voting Rights Act and the new updated version of that, right? I mean, but the reality is that if these laws pass and voters and residents do not know about them and then do not understand them and then do not believe in them, right, then the impact is still very like real on what does that, potentially hinder them from moving forward and voting or not, right? So I think like that piece around like deep community organizing, outreach and education, and really investing again in year round, like campaigns and programs. But even beyond campaigns and programs, what Bella said earlier, like infrastructure, right? So I would say to the funders and the donors on the call today, like really, invest in infrastructure and not just programs, because there is a real difference, right? Like for what we did, Move the Valley ran a 43-person election protectors program, like, and we did that, and there was a start and an end to that. But infrastructure building in the region, right, is a forever thing. And the infrastructure to even be able to put together something like that took the last 10 years of Move being a coalition that is in solidarity with each other, that has, a racial justice, a economic justice like lens, and a democracy forward, approach to the work that we want to accomplish in the region, right? So I would definitely say, like, fund the infrastructure, fund the folks who are bridging that gap and building those relationships with residents, with elections offices, right, with like policymakers, in addition to the things that make you feel good as well, which is like X amount of program and X amount of people moved, and those things that you might want to quantify in that way. But it's a lot harder to name infrastructure growth in progress. Yeah.
Hmm. This issue really gets me. Look, California counts slowly because it makes voting open and accessible, and that's a feature, not a flaw, right? We accept every ballot postmarked by election day. We let voters fix signature problems before their ballots rejected. We verify every single mail signature by hand. Okay, that's a security mechanism. And every one of those steps takes time. Every one of them protects a real voter's ballot. A slow count it's not a sign that the system is broken, it's a sign that it's careful. You know, having said that, I think there are ways to speed things up around the edges if we resource elections officials and message early voting, right? Which we need to do anyway. We should do those things, but not ever at the expense of enfranchising voters, never at the expense of what we have put into place to make California, one of the leaders in election reform. Um, I understand that there is an argument that the delay itself fuels conspiracy theories. It does, and that's precisely why this is really a voter education problem, not an administration problem. The fix is not to count faster and sacrifice accuracy. It's to explain before election day why a full count takes time. And I truly believe that when people understand it, that conspiracy sort of loses its oxygen. And I am very concerned about this sort of piling on of the national press around this issue when they absolutely do not understand what we do in California to protect people's votes.
Thank you, Dora. We have limited time. I want to open it up for folks in the audience. Please feel free to come off mute. I know we had a question in the chat. The question is, would be curious if any of the speakers might share thoughts on how they've prepared their organizers and volunteers doing the work from physical and emotional safety perspective, trainings or resources for such. Mai, you're probably most apt to answer this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, there's a few different angles, right? Just to give you a taste, like our canvasser training is, I think, 4 hours. Our, leads training is 6 hours. Our phone banker training is again 4 hours. Our leads training is 6 hours for that. And then, like I said earlier, like for our pool protectors, it was a new kind of training program that we kind of built from scratch with some of the materials from Can't Stop California, and that was 3 hours. And I think like we're really honest in these conversations, right? One with Move and the framework that we have around our theory of change and our theory of practice, and being that we're going into neighborhoods that are not going to be, the most presentable neighborhoods. We're going into neighborhoods that really have the broken street lights, who, you're knocking on the door, and we had a canvasser provide feedback and said, yeah, I knocked on the door and the guy said, I'm really surprised that you're in this hood because only like cops roll around in this hood. But because you took the time to come talk to me, like, don't worry, I got your back, like in the next 2 blocks. So if anybody gives you a hard time, right? Like, because you chose our house to come to like listen to what we care about, right? So I think that like, can we have better like policies and procedures around like full safety and what makes people uncomfortable versus comfortable? I mean, I think even that word of comfortability is really, really hard in this line of work, right? Because a white woman feeling uncomfortable with a black man bird watching in Central Park leads to an arrest, right? And, like, so it's like really having that conversation with our canvassers around like unpacking like what you might feel like, individually bringing into this work, but understanding our mission and our vision and what we might need to take, like down from you personally and while you're on the shift and on the job. And then again, we have like lots of little things that we built in with our supervisors. For example, like if you do have a really, really hard, like racially, like aggressive, hostile call, right, or experience, you are allowed to take a break and talk to your supervisor and talk that through. And then we figure out what are other resources you would need after that shift or after that moment, really, to work through that moment, right? And so I think that we are really conscious that this is emotionally tolling, but at the same time, we are working with, we're recruiting and hiring, and our volunteers are people who are from these neighborhoods. So they actually care about going back in and making a change. It's just not from afar. It's not an outsider going into a rough neighborhood. It's like, this is actually my hood too. This is my turf too. And when you have somebody with that built in into your team, then it really does make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to go off mute or type it in the chat box. Well, I want to thank everybody for their time. Matthew, I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you again for all the speakers for, sharing all your insights and wisdom. I think it was just so good to hear about all the different layers of what work goes into securing elections, furthering and bolstering democracy. From Dora, you telling us more about what's going on the federal level and the policy level, to what funders are thinking about and how they can better support this ecosystem of work, and then Maya, all of the stuff that you've been doing on the ground as well. So just amazing to hear, and really glad that we were able to bring it all together. So as a reminder, all registered attendees and participants will get these slides after this. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again. Join us for our next California Policy Forum. We host these once a quarter, and really wanting to unify both the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors together. Thank you again, and we'll send out a recording, resources, and other things following this.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank
Take care.
you.
You all.